Some trusted him with their lives. He took them instead. Welcome to the Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross, and tonight we're opening a case that still haunts the British medical system 2 decades later. A file so disturbing, so incomprehensible in its scope, that it changed how an entire nation views the oath to do no harm. Before we begin, I need to ask something of you. This is a new channel, and we're building something different here. A place where forgotten cases find their voice, where the darkest corners of human nature are examined with the respect they deserve. We're trying to reach 100 subscribers, and if you value storytelling that doesn't look away from the uncomfortable truths, I'm asking you to subscribe. Hit that button now. And if this story moves you, haunts you, or makes you question everything you thought you knew about trust, give us a like. We'd love to reach 50 likes on this video. It tells me you're listening. It tells me these stories matter. And please, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I want to know how far these files travel, how many borders the truth can cross. Now, let's begin. This is a true story. Between 1975 and 1998, in the quiet towns of northern England, a man in a white coat moved through the homes of the elderly like a shadow at dusk. He carried a black medical bag. He smiled reassuringly. He sat beside dying patients and held their hands as the light left their eyes, light that he himself had extinguished. His name was Harold Frederick Shipman. To his patients, he was simply Dr. Shipman, a caring, attentive family physician who made house calls, who remembered birthdays, who seemed to genuinely care. To the community of Hyde, Greater Manchester, he was a pillar of respectability, a doctor who embodied everything medicine should be. But to history he became something else entirely: Dr. Death, Britain's most prolific serial offender in modern times, a man who ended between 215 and 250 lives, though he was convicted of only 15. A man who weaponized the very trust that medicine depends upon, who turned healing into an art of destruction so subtle, so perfectly camouflaged within the ordinary rhythms of general practice, that he continued undetected for over 2 decades. This is his story. But more than that, it's a story about the systems that failed, the warnings that went unheeded, and the terrible price of blind trust. Let's go back to the beginning. Harold Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England. Nothing about his early life suggested the darkness that would later consume him. He was the second of 4 children, born to a working-class family. His mother, Vera, was a formidable woman, ambitious for her children, particularly for Harold, whom she considered special. She instilled in him a sense of exceptionalism, a belief that he was destined for something greater than the modest circumstances of his birth. Harold was a diligent student, though not naturally gifted. What he lacked in brilliance, he compensated for with sheer determination. He passed his 11+ examination and attended the local grammar school, where he distinguished himself through hard work rather than exceptional talent. His classmates remembered him as somewhat aloof, a young man who kept his distance, who seemed to be playing a role rather than simply being himself. But at 17, something happened that would shape the trajectory of his entire life. His mother, Vera, was diagnosed with lung cancer. Harold watched as the disease consumed her, day by day, week by week. He witnessed her pain, her slow deterioration, the way her body betrayed her, and he watched as their family doctor arrived each day to administer morphine injections, the only thing that could provide her relief. Vera died when Harold was 17. He was the last person to see her alive. Later, much later, psychiatrists would dissect this moment, trying to understand what it planted in the young man's psyche. Was it trauma, a repetition compulsion, a subconscious need to replay that scene but with himself in control? Or was it something darker, a fascination with the power those injections held, the power to ease suffering, the power to end life itself? We'll never know. Shipman himself never spoke honestly about it. What we do know is that after his mother's passing, Harold redoubled his efforts. He failed his first attempt at medical school entrance exams, but persisted, eventually gaining admission to Leeds University Medical School in 1965. He was 20 years old. At medical school, he met Primrose Oxtoby, a 17-year-old window dresser. She was 3 months pregnant when they married in 1966. By all accounts, their marriage was stable, conventional. They would eventually have 4 children together. To neighbors and colleagues, the Shipmans appeared unremarkable, a hard-working doctor and his supportive wife, raising their family in modest middle-class comfort. Harold qualified as a physician in 1970 and began his career in general practice. His early years were uneventful. He worked at the Pontefract General Infirmary in Yorkshire, then joined a general practice in Todmorden, West Yorkshire, in 1974. It was in Todmorden that the first cracks appeared, and it was in Todmorden that the first bodies fell. 1974. Todmorden, a small mill town nestled in the Pennine Hills, where fog settled in the valleys and everyone knew everyone else's business. Dr. Shipman joined the Abraham Ormerod Medical Center as a junior partner. He was energetic, dedicated, willing to make house calls at all hours. Patients appreciated his attentiveness, his willingness to spend time with them. He seemed in every way like an asset to the practice. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. Shipman had developed an addiction to pethidine, a powerful opioid painkiller similar to morphine. How it began, we don't know. Perhaps it started as occasional self-medication for stress or minor ailments. Perhaps it was something darker, an echo of those injections his mother had received years before. What we do know is that by 1975, Shipman was forging prescriptions on an industrial scale. He wrote false prescriptions in patients' names, claiming the medication was for them when in reality it was for himself. He injected so frequently that the veins in his arms collapsed. He suffered blackouts which he attributed to epilepsy, another lie. When staff members found him passed out at the practice, he blamed it on seizures, never admitting the truth. A receptionist named Marjorie Walker became suspicious. The drugs register showed massive quantities of pethidine being prescribed, far more than any legitimate practice could justify. She brought her concerns to the senior partners. An investigation began. When confronted, Shipman initially lied, then partially admitted his addiction. In February 1976, he appeared before Halifax Magistrates' Court. He was charged with 8 offences related to obtaining pethidine by deception and forgery. He asked for 74 additional offences to be taken into consideration. 74. The court fined him £600, a slap on the wrist. He received no prison time. The Abraham Ormerod Medical Center terminated his employment, but that was all. And here's where the system first failed. The General Medical Council, the regulatory body responsible for overseeing medical professionals in Britain, did not strike Harold Shipman from the medical register. They didn't even formally censure him. After completing rehabilitation at the Retreat in York, a psychiatric facility, Shipman was allowed to return to medical practice. It's impossible to overstate what this meant. A doctor who had forged prescriptions, who had systematically stolen controlled substances, who had demonstrated profound dishonesty and a willingness to exploit his position for personal gain, this man was permitted to continue practicing medicine. If stories like this disturb you, if they make you question the systems we trust with our lives, then subscribe to this channel, because the files only get darker from here, and someone needs to remember what happens when we look away. Shipman moved to Hyde, Greater Manchester, in 1977. He joined the Donnybrook Medical Center as a junior partner, and for the first few years he kept his head down. He worked hard, rebuilt his reputation, and slowly earned back the trust he'd squandered. But something else was happening too. People were starting to pass away. At first, no one noticed anything unusual. Deaths among elderly patients are a normal part of general practice. Doctors who work with vulnerable populations will inevitably sign death certificates more frequently than those working with younger, healthier demographics. But Shipman's death rate was different. His patients didn't just pass away more often. They passed away in specific ways, at specific times, under specific circumstances, that when examined years later, formed a pattern so clear it seems impossible that no one saw it earlier. They passed away during home visits, usually in the afternoon around 2 o'clock. They passed away suddenly, despite being in relatively good health. They passed away alone with Dr. Shipman, who would then calmly inform family members that death had been due to natural causes, heart failure, stroke, or some other plausible explanation, and they passed away at a rate that was statistically impossible. Between 1977 and 1998, Harold Shipman ended the lives of at least 215 people. The true number may be as high as 250, or even higher. We'll never know for certain, because many of the bodies were cremated, many of the medical records were destroyed, and Harold Shipman himself took the truth to his grave. His weapon was diamorphine, pharmaceutical-grade heroin, the same substance used in hospitals for pain management in terminal patients. It's powerful, fast-acting, and when administered in large doses, it causes respiratory depression, unconsciousness, and eventual cardiac arrest. Death arrives like sleep, quietly, without struggle. His method was devastatingly simple. He would visit patients at their homes, ostensibly for routine checkups or to administer treatment for minor ailments. He would prepare a syringe explaining that it was vitamin B12 or an antibiotic or something else perfectly innocent. The patient would barely feel the needle, and then he would wait. Within minutes, the patient would become drowsy. Their breathing would slow, their eyes would close, and Dr. Shipman would sit beside them, sometimes holding their hand, watching as they slipped from unconsciousness into the absence beyond. When they stopped breathing, he would call the family. His voice would be gentle, sympathetic. "I'm afraid I have some bad news. Your mother's heart gave out. It was very peaceful. She didn't suffer." And because he was a doctor, because he was trusted, because he had been there, the families believed him. He would then sign the death certificate himself, listing whatever cause seemed most plausible: coronary thrombosis, heart failure, cerebrovascular accident. And because death certification in Britain at that time relied almost entirely on the judgment of the certifying doctor, there was no external verification, no second opinion, no safeguard at all. The bodies were cremated or buried. The families mourned. Life went on, and Harold Shipman continued. Let me give you some numbers, because numbers sometimes tell stories that words cannot. In a typical general practice in Britain during the 1990s, approximately 2% of deaths occurred in patients' homes between 2 and 3 p.m. In Harold Shipman's practice, 12% of deaths occurred during that same hour. Patients who had home visits from Shipman were 3 times more likely to pass away within 30 minutes of his arrival than patients seeing other doctors. 79.5% of his confirmed victims were women. Most were over 70 years old. Many were widows, living alone, socially isolated. They were vulnerable, they were trusting, and they were invisible. That's the word that keeps coming back when you study this case: invisible. These were people the world had already begun to forget. Elderly women living quiet lives in working-class neighborhoods, their families busy with their own concerns, their social circles shrinking year by year. When they disappeared, it barely left a ripple, and Harold Shipman understood this. Whether consciously or not, he selected victims who would be easy to explain away, whose passing would be seen as natural, expected, unremarkable. But he made mistakes too. Or perhaps they weren't mistakes. Perhaps they were the inevitable result of addiction, of compulsion, of the need to continue escalating, because that's what was happening. Shipman's rate of ending lives was accelerating. In the early years, the deaths were sporadic, spread out over time. But by the 1990s, they were occurring with increasing frequency. Between 1992 and 1998, the pace quickened dramatically. Forensic psychiatrists who later studied the case compared it to drug addiction. The high fades, tolerance builds. You need more often just to feel the same rush. Harold Shipman was, in every sense that matters, addicted to taking lives. If this story is reaching you, wherever you are in the world, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. These files travel farther than I ever imagined, and I want to know how many borders the truth can cross. By the mid-1990s, cracks were forming in Harold Shipman's perfect facade. Several people, doctors, coroners, family members, began to notice something wasn't right. In 1985, a local undertaker commented to his colleagues about the unusually high number of Shipman's patients requiring his services. Nothing came of it. In 1990, Another doctor at the Donnybrook Medical Center expressed concerns about Shipman's death rate. The concern was noted, but not investigated. In 1992, a taxi driver named John Shaw became suspicious when his 71-year-old mother-in-law, Renate Overton, passed away suddenly after a visit from Dr. Shipman. She had been in good health. Shipman claimed she'd had a heart attack, but something about his manner troubled Shaw. He reported his concerns to the local coroner. The coroner took no action. These were isolated voices, easily dismissed. But they were accumulating. The breakthrough, or rather the near breakthrough, came in March 1998. Dr. Linda Reynolds was a general practitioner working at the Brooks Surgery in Hyde, just down the road from Shipman's practice. Part of her job involved countersigning cremation certificates, a legal requirement intended to provide an additional safeguard against wrongful deaths being certified. Dr. Reynolds began to notice that she was countersigning an unusual number of cremation forms for Shipman's patients, and they followed a pattern: elderly women, sudden deaths, certified by Shipman himself. On March 17, 1998, Dr. Reynolds contacted John Pollard, the South Manchester coroner, to express her concerns. Pollard took her seriously. He contacted the Greater Manchester Police. A police investigation began, and this is where the story becomes infuriating. Detective Inspector David Smith was assigned to lead the investigation. He was an experienced officer, but he was not experienced in this type of case. The investigation that followed was, by any objective standard, catastrophically inadequate. Police officers interviewed Harold Shipman on April 7, 1998. He was cooperative, articulate, and utterly convincing. He explained that his practice had a high proportion of elderly patients, many in poor health. He pointed out that he made more house calls than most modern GPs, which naturally meant he was present for more deaths. Everything he said was superficially plausible. The police examined some death certificates but failed to conduct any meaningful statistical analysis. They didn't compare Shipman's death rate to other practices with similar patient demographics. They didn't interview families of deceased patients. They didn't examine medical records in detail. They didn't consult with medical experts who might have identified the abnormal patterns. On April 17, 1998, exactly 1 month after Dr. Reynolds first raised her concerns, the police closed the investigation. Insufficient evidence, they concluded, and Harold Shipman went back to work. Over the next 3 months, he ended 3 more lives: Winifred Meller on May 11th, Joan Melia on June 12th, and finally, on June 24, 1998, a woman named Kathleen Grundy. Kathleen Grundy would be his last victim, but she would also be his undoing. Mrs. Kathleen Grundy was 81 years old in the summer of 1998, but she was not a typical 81-year-old. She was energetic, active, deeply involved in her community. She volunteered at a local charity shop. She organized community events. She was sharp, independent, and very much in control of her life. She was also wealthy. Her estate was valued at £386,000. On the morning of June 24, 1998, Mrs. Grundy visited some friends to discuss plans for an upcoming event. She seemed perfectly well. That afternoon, Dr. Shipman visited her at her home on Joel Lane in Hyde. He told neighbors he was taking a blood sample for routine tests. Several hours later, Mrs. Grundy's friends became concerned when she failed to appear at the charity shop where she volunteered. They went to her home. The front door was unlocked, unusual for Mrs. Grundy, who was careful about security. They found her lying fully clothed on her sofa. She was already cold. Dr. Shipman was contacted. He arrived, examined the body briefly, and told the friends that Mrs. Grundy had passed away. He said she'd been in poor health, which was completely untrue, and suggested the cause was likely old age or perhaps a stroke. He signed the death certificate, listing old age as the cause. Mrs. Grundy's body was cremated on July 10, 1998, and that should have been the end of it. Another elderly woman, another cremation, another case closed. But Harold Shipman had made a fatal error. He had forged Mrs. Grundy's will. The will was typed, unusual for someone of Mrs. Grundy's generation, who would typically have used a solicitor to draft a formal document. It was dated the previous year and left her entire estate to Harold Frederick Shipman. The will was sent to a local solicitor named Brian Burgess, who passed it on to Mrs. Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff. Angela Woodruff was herself a solicitor, a lawyer specializing in estate law. She took one look at the document and knew immediately that it was fraudulent. The signature was wrong. The witnesses were questionable. The language was amateurish. The typewriter font was outdated. And perhaps most damningly, the idea that her mother would leave everything to her GP, cutting out her own family, was absurd. Angela Woodruff contacted the police. This time, they listened. Detective Superintendent Bernard Postles took charge of the new investigation. Unlike the previous inquiry, this one would be thorough, methodical, and devastating. On August 1st, 1998, police applied for permission to exhume Kathleen Grundy's body. Despite having been cremated being the usual practice, they were fortunate that, in this case, I apologize, let me correct that. I need to verify. Kathleen Grundy's body was actually cremated on July 10th. However, I should note that the investigation continued with other victims whose bodies could be exhumed. Police began by examining the will itself. Forensic analysis confirmed what Angela Woodruff had immediately recognized. The document was a crude forgery. The signatures of the supposed witnesses appeared to have been traced or copied. The typewriter used was eventually traced to a machine Shipman had used, but the real breakthrough came from computers. Shipman had kept computerized medical records, relatively advanced for a GP practice in the 1990s. After Kathleen Grundy's passing, he had gone back into her medical records and added entries suggesting she'd been unwell, that she'd complained of various symptoms consistent with declining health. What he didn't realize was that the computer system time-stamped every entry. Forensic computer analysts examined the records and discovered that Shipman had made these additions on June 24th and the days immediately after Mrs. Grundy had already passed. He'd tried to rewrite history, to create a medical narrative that would support his claim that she'd been in declining health. The timestamps exposed his lie. Police began exhuming bodies of other patients who had passed under suspicious circumstances. Toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of diamorphine in tissue samples. The evidence was overwhelming. On September 7, 1998, Harold Frederick Shipman was arrested at his practice and charged with the ending of Kathleen Grundy's life. As the investigation continued, additional charges were added, eventually 15 counts in total, along with forgery charges related to the will. The trial began on October 5, 1999, at Preston Crown Court. The trial lasted 57 days. It was a media sensation. The story of a trusted family doctor who had been secretly ending lives for decades was almost incomprehensible to the British public. The prosecution, led by Richard Henriquez QC, presented a damning case. They called family members who described how their loved ones had been in good health before Shipman's final visit. They presented toxicology reports showing lethal levels of diamorphine. They showed the fraudulent will. They displayed the computer records with their incriminating timestamps. But perhaps most devastating was the statistical evidence. Professor Richard Gill, a statistician from Leiden University, analyzed Shipman's death rates compared to other general practitioners with similar patient demographics. The numbers were staggering. The probability that Shipman's death rate could have occurred by chance was vanishingly small, less than 1 in a billion. The defense, led by Nicola Davies QC, argued that Shipman was the victim of a conspiracy, that the deaths were coincidental, that the medical evidence was ambiguous. They portrayed him as a dedicated doctor who had been targeted because he made house calls and worked with elderly patients. Harold Shipman himself testified for 5 days. He was articulate, composed, and utterly convincing, at least at first. He maintained his innocence throughout. He claimed that patients had been in worse health than their families realized. He suggested that Kathleen Grundy had been addicted to diamorphine, which was why it appeared in her system, a claim so absurd that even his own defense team seemed uncomfortable with it. But under cross-examination, cracks appeared. He became defensive, argumentative, sometimes arrogant. When confronted with the computer timestamps, he had no good explanation. When asked about the forged will, he claimed ignorance, despite the typewriter being traced to his practice. The jury deliberated for 6 days. On January 31st, 2000, they returned their verdict. Guilty on all 15 counts. The trial judge, Mr. Justice Forbes, addressed Shipman directly. His words are worth remembering. These were callous, cruel crimes. You took advantage of the trust that patients placed in you. You have shown no remorse, no contrition. I have no doubt that you will never be released. Harold Shipman was sentenced to 15 life terms, with the recommendation that he should never be released from prison. But this was only the beginning of understanding what he had done. If this story has stayed with you, if you find yourself thinking about it hours later, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because the truth, no matter how dark, deserves to be remembered. Following Shipman's conviction, the British government established the Shipman Inquiry, chaired by High Court Judge Dame Janet Smith. The inquiry had 2 mandates. First, to determine the full extent of Shipman's actions. Second, to understand how the systems had failed and what reforms were needed. What the inquiry discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. Dame Janet Smith and her team examined 888 deaths, every single patient who had passed away under Shipman's care during his 24-year career. They interviewed families, examined medical records, reviewed cremation certificates, analyzed statistical patterns. In July 2002, the inquiry's first report was published. The findings were stark. Harold Shipman had unlawfully ended the lives of at least 215 patients. Dame Janet Smith noted there was real suspicion that he'd ended an additional 45 lives, with another 38 cases remaining inconclusive. The total death toll could be as high as 250 or possibly even higher. 215 confirmed victims. Think about that number. Try to picture 215 people, their faces, their lives, their families, their memories, their hopes for the quiet years they thought they had remaining. All gone, all extinguished by a man they trusted. 79.5% of the confirmed victims were women. The youngest was 41-year-old Peter Lewis. The oldest was 93-year-old Anne Cooper. But the typical victim was a woman in her 70s or 80s, living alone, often widowed, often socially isolated. The inquiry also revealed something else, something that made the case even more disturbing. Shipman's crimes had been enabled by systematic failures across multiple institutions. It wasn't just bad luck or one oversight, it was a web of failures, any one of which, if properly addressed, might have stopped him years earlier. Let me walk you through them. The death certification system in Britain in the 1990s was, by any reasonable standard, archaic and dangerous. When a patient passed away, the attending doctor simply filled out a certificate stating the cause, and that was that. No second opinion was required for most deaths. No external verification, no oversight. For cremations, a second doctor was supposed to examine the deceased and countersign the cremation certificate. But this was treated as a formality, a bureaucratic requirement rather than a genuine safeguard. Doctors would often countersign based on nothing more than a brief examination and trust in their colleagues' judgment. The system assumed that doctors were trustworthy, and in the vast majority of cases they are. But the system had no mechanism to detect the rare individual who wasn't. Harold Shipman signed over 300 death certificates during his career. Not one was ever seriously questioned by the certification system itself. The controlled drug system was equally flawed. Shipman obtained most of his diamorphine supply through a simple method. He would overprescribe to terminal patients, telling them or their families that he was giving them enough medication to manage pain at home. Then, when those patients passed away, he would visit the homes and collect the unused drugs, often before families even realized they were there. He essentially ran his own pharmaceutical supply operation from his practice, stockpiling enough diamorphine to end approximately 1,500 lives. There were supposed to be inspections of controlled drug registers, records that every GP was required to maintain showing all controlled substances prescribed and administered. But after 1990, these inspections became inconsistent and poorly coordinated. Shipman's drug register was never properly audited. The complaint system failed repeatedly. Between 1985 and 1998, at least 6 separate complaints or expressions of concern were made about Shipman to various authorities. health boards, coroners, even the General Medical Council in one instance. None were properly investigated. Each was treated in isolation, as an anomaly rather than part of a pattern. There was no system for aggregating complaints, for identifying doctors who generated multiple concerns, for distinguishing between the usual frictions of medical practice and something genuinely dangerous. And then there was the police investigation of March 1998, the investigation that failed so spectacularly that it allowed Shipman to end 3 more lives before finally being stopped. The Shipman inquiry was scathing in its assessment of that investigation. Dame Janet Smith found that police had assigned inexperienced officers to a case that required specialized expertise. The officers failed to understand the statistical significance of what Dr. Reynolds was reporting. They failed to conduct proper interviews. They failed to examine sufficient evidence. They failed to consult with experts who could have helped them understand what they were looking at. It was, in every sense, a catastrophic failure of policing. But perhaps the deepest failure was cultural. Britain in the 1990s still operated on a deep-seated trust in doctors, particularly general practitioners. The GP was a respected community figure, someone you trusted with your life, literally. The idea that a GP might deliberately harm patients was almost unthinkable. This trust was not entirely misplaced. The vast majority of doctors are ethical, dedicated professionals who take their oath seriously. But the problem was that the systems were built on an assumption of trust rather than on verification and oversight. Dame Janet Smith put it bluntly in her report. The General Medical Council had been an organization designed to look after the interests of doctors, not patients. That sentence should haunt us. The GMC's primary function, historically, had been to protect the medical profession, to defend doctors against frivolous complaints, to maintain the prestige and autonomy of the profession. Patient protection was secondary, almost an afterthought. This meant that when complaints were made, when concerns were raised, when red flags appeared, the instinct was to protect the doctor, to give them the benefit of the doubt, to avoid damaging their reputation or career unless absolutely necessary. Harold Shipman had understood this instinctively. He'd been caught once, in Todmorden, with his pethidine addiction. He'd received minimal consequences. He'd learned that the system would forgive, would allow him to continue, would trust him again, and he'd exploited that trust for 24 years. The Shipman inquiry made 109 recommendations for reform. Many have since been implemented, fundamentally changing how medicine is practiced and regulated in Britain. Death certification now requires independent medical examiners who scrutinize all deaths not reported to a coroner. These examiners are employed by local authorities, not by the NHS, ensuring independence from the medical system they're overseeing. Controlled drugs monitoring has been completely overhauled, with better tracking systems and more rigorous inspections. The General Medical Council underwent major reforms with new requirements for revalidation, mandatory appraisals and the explicit emphasis on patient protection over professional protection. Cremation certificate procedures were tightened, requiring genuine scrutiny rather than perfunctory countersigning. The complaint system was reformed to identify patterns rather than treating each complaint in isolation. And perhaps most importantly, new statistical monitoring systems were developed to identify doctors whose mortality or morbidity rates differ significantly from their peers, systems designed to detect future shipments before they can harm dozens, let alone hundreds, of patients. These reforms represent the most comprehensive overhaul of British medical regulation in a century. They've made the system significantly safer. But Dame Janet Smith herself warned that the risk of a deliberate ending going unrecognized still persists. No system can be perfect. No safeguards can be absolute. As long as humans practice medicine, the possibility remains that a sufficiently intelligent, manipulative, and conscienceless individual could exploit the system. The eternal challenge is maintaining robust safeguards while preserving the trust and professional autonomy that medicine requires to function at all. Before we continue to the end of this story, I want to ask one more time, if this content matters to you, if you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. We're building something important here. And your support makes it possible. Harold Shipman spent his final years at HMP Wakefield in West Yorkshire, a maximum security prison housing some of Britain's most dangerous offenders. By most accounts, he adjusted to prison life reasonably well. He maintained his innocence, refusing to admit any wrongdoing. He became, in a peculiar twist, an informal medical advisor to other inmates, offering health advice and opinions, still playing the role of the caring doctor even behind bars. But he never confessed. He never expressed remorse. He never explained why. Families of victims wanted answers. They wanted to understand. They wanted to hear him admit what he'd done, to acknowledge their loved one's suffering, to provide some kind of closure. He gave them nothing. On the night of January 12, 2004, Harold Shipman prepared for bed as usual in his cell. He had been in prison for 4 years. He was 57 years old, one day away from his 58th birthday. Sometime during that night, he fashioned a noose from bed sheets. He attached it to the window bars of his cell, and he hanged himself. He was discovered by prison staff during their early morning rounds on January 13th. Despite immediate resuscitation efforts, he was pronounced gone at 8:10 a.m. He left no note, no explanation, no final confession. The Prisons and Probation Ombudsman investigated as required for all deaths in custody. They found that prison staff had followed proper procedures, that there had been no warning signs, that Shipman had given no indication of his intentions, but to the families of his victims, his self-ending was one final betrayal. Danny Mellor, whose 73-year-old mother, Winifred, had been one of Shipman's final victims, expressed what many felt. "I've always harbored a secret desire to confront him, though I know it would never have been allowed. Now we'll never know why he did it." The question of why haunts this case even now, 2 decades later. Why did Harold Shipman do what he did? Forensic psychiatrists and psychologists have offered various theories, but the truth is, we don't know. Shipman took his reasons to his grave, and without his cooperation, we're left with speculation. Some experts pointed to his mother's passing, the trauma of watching her suffer, the morphine injections that eased her pain, the complex psychological impact of being present at her ending. Perhaps, they suggested, he was trying to rewrite that trauma, to give elderly women the peaceful ending he wished his mother had experienced. It's a tidy theory, but it feels incomplete. Others focused on his narcissism, his inflated sense of his own importance, his need for control and power, his apparent enjoyment of the godlike authority to decide who lived and who passed away. He thrived on being respected, admired, trusted, and secretly, he held the ultimate power over life itself. There's also the addiction theory. Dame Janet Smith's inquiry concluded that Shipman displayed characteristics consistent with addiction to ending lives. Professor Jeremy Coyd, a forensic psychiatrist who studied the case, noted a clear pattern of escalation, similar to drug addiction, where tolerance builds and the user requires increasing doses to achieve the same effect. Shipman's rate of taking lives accelerated dramatically between 1992 and 1998, suggesting an intensifying compulsion rather than rational motivation. He wasn't doing it for money. Most victims left him nothing. He wasn't doing it for notoriety. He tried desperately to remain undetected. He wasn't doing it for any obvious reason at all. He did it because he needed to, because somewhere in the architecture of his psychology, the act of ending a life had become its own reward. Some witnesses recalled Shipman's behavioral shifts, how he could be warm and attentive one moment, then cold and distant immediately after a patient had passed. This split personality, this compartmentalization, allowed him to maintain his self-image as a healer while simultaneously being a destroyer of life. Forensic psychiatrist Richard Badcock noted that Shipman's need for control went beyond mere narcissism. It was pathologically central to his identity. His compulsive need to control and dominate appeared to drive his actions more than any rational motive of financial gain or gratification. But these are all theories, educated guesses based on patterns and profiles of other offenders. The truth is that Harold Shipman was, in many ways, unique. Most individuals who end multiple lives fit into recognizable categories. They have clear motives, identifiable triggers, predictable patterns. Shipman doesn't fit neatly into any category. He was a middle-aged, married, Respectable professional with no obvious psychological breaks, no dramatic life crises during his offending years, no clear benefit from his actions. He was a cipher, a mystery wrapped in respectability. And that, perhaps, is what makes his case so disturbing. Let me tell you about Hyde. Hyde is a small town in Greater Manchester with a population of about 30,000 people. It's working class, unpretentious, the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbours, where the local GP is a trusted community figure. For over 20 years, that GP was Harold Shipman. The revelation of what he'd done devastated the community in ways that are difficult to articulate. It wasn't just grief, though there was plenty of that. It was betrayal on a scale almost impossible to process. Imagine learning that the doctor who treated your children's ear infections, who visited your elderly mother during her final illness, who sat in your living room offering comfort and medical wisdom. Imagine learning that this same man had been systematically ending lives throughout your neighborhood for 2 decades. Imagine walking past the homes where he'd done it. Imagine seeing his former practice building. Imagine the memories you'd carry of friendly consultations and house calls, all now recontextualized by the knowledge of what he truly was. The psychological impact on Hyde was profound and lasting. 25 years after Shipman's conviction, residents still report living with the aftermath. Trust in the medical profession, particularly in general practitioners, was severely damaged. Some elderly residents became fearful of home visits, worried about being alone with any doctor. Others struggled with grief compounded by guilt, wondering if they should have seen something, should have known something, should have protected their loved ones. The case also exposed vulnerabilities specific to small, close-knit communities. Shipman's status as a dedicated single-handed GP who made house calls was precisely what made him valuable to his patients and to the NHS. But it was also what made his crimes possible. He operated with minimal oversight. His dedication to home visits, which many patients appreciated as old-fashioned, caring medicine, meant he spent extended time alone with vulnerable people. His single-handed practice meant there were no colleagues observing his patterns, no partners questioning his unusually high death rate. The very qualities that made him seem like an ideal doctor were the qualities that enabled him to become Britain's most prolific individual who ended lives in modern times. Today, Harold Shipman's name has become synonymous with the dangers of unchecked professional autonomy, institutional complacency, and the terrible fragility of trust. Medical students in Britain study the Shipman case as a cautionary tale. Healthcare administrators cite it when discussing the importance of robust oversight systems. Regulatory bodies reference it when explaining the need for revalidation and monitoring. But beyond the policy discussions and the regulatory reforms, there are the families. Over 200 families who lost mothers, fathers, grandmothers, grandfathers, aunts, uncles, friends. People who thought their loved ones had passed away naturally, peacefully, inevitably, only to learn years later that they'd been taken deliberately, needlessly by a man who enjoyed the act of ending their lives. Many of these families never received justice in the formal legal sense. Only 15 of Shipman's victims were represented in his criminal trial. The Director of Public Prosecutions decided against prosecuting additional cases, reasoning that the massive publicity surrounding the first trial would make it impossible for Shipman to receive a fair trial on further charges. This decision, while legally defensible, meant that hundreds of families were denied the closure of seeing their loved one's case prosecuted in court, of hearing the evidence presented, of receiving a formal legal acknowledgement of what had been done. Many inquests into suspected Shipman victims were held up or never completed due to the inquiry proceedings. The Lord Chancellor adjourned inquests into 232 deaths, pending the inquiry's findings. When some inquests eventually occurred, coroners recorded verdicts of unlawful ending in 25 cases and open verdicts in others, meaning the cause was never definitively established. For these families, there was no catharsis, no moment of official recognition, no public acknowledgement of their loss. Just the cold knowledge delivered in a formal inquiry report that their loved one had been taken by Dr. Death. I want to share with you the story of one victim, because numbers, even numbers as staggering as 215, can become abstract. They can lose their humanity. Her name was Kathleen Wagstaff. She was 81 years old when she passed away on December 9th, 1998. Wait, I need to correct myself. Let me share the story of Joan Harding instead, as her case illustrates the pattern so clearly. Actually, let me be more careful here. Rather than risk getting specific details wrong about individual victims, let me speak more broadly about what these lives represented. These were mothers who had raised children through post-war Britain, who had worked factory jobs and cleaned houses and held families together through difficult times. These were grandmothers who baked cakes for school fetes and knitted blankets and told stories about the old days. These were women who had earned their rest, their peaceful final years, their dignity, and they were denied all of it by a man they trusted. Each of them has a name, each has a story, each has a family that still carries the weight of what was done. The Shipman inquiry tried to honor them by documenting each case individually, by giving each victim a place in the historical record. It's not enough. It can never be enough, but it's something. If you've stayed with me this far, through this long and difficult story, then you understand why channels like this matter. Subscribe. Share this video. Leave a comment. Let me know this story reached you, wherever you are in the world, because remembering is the only justice some victims will ever receive. I want to return to that question one more time. Why? Why did Harold Shipman do what he did? I've given you the theories, the trauma, the narcissism, the addiction, the need for control, but I want to offer one more possibility, one that's harder to articulate, but that I think gets closer to the truth. I think Harold Shipman did it because he could. That sounds simplistic, but bear with me. Think about the progression of his life. He witnesses his mother's passing, receives morphine injections, experiences the power those injections hold. He becomes a doctor, enters general practice, develops a pethidine addiction, gets caught, faces consequences, and then gets away with it. The system forgives him, allows him to return, trusts him again. And at some point, perhaps early in his time in Todmorden, or perhaps later in Hyde, he realizes something. He can end a life, and no one will know. He can administer a lethal injection, watch a patient pass away, sign the death certificate, and face absolutely no consequences. The system isn't just flawed, it's blind. It trusts him completely. It gives him godlike power with no oversight whatsoever. For someone with his psychology, narcissistic, controlling, compartmentalized, that realization must have been intoxicating. He could do something that society says is the ultimate transgression, and he could do it in plain sight, could do it while being respected and admired, could do it while maintaining his image as a caring physician. The first time might have been experimental, perhaps even rationalized, telling himself he was ending suffering, providing a peaceful passing, playing God in a benevolent way. But then he did it again, and each time nothing happened. No investigation, no suspicion, no consequences. Just more trust, more respect, more power. And that became its own reward. The act itself, the secret knowledge of what he'd done, the thrill of fooling everyone, the godlike sensation of holding life and death in his hands, that became what he needed. It wasn't about the victims themselves. They were, in a horrible sense, interchangeable. What mattered was the act, the power, the secret. He did it because he could, and he kept doing it because he kept getting away with it until he didn't. The Kathleen Grundy case, the forged will, was a deviation from his pattern. For 23 years, Shipman had ended lives without seeking financial gain. He'd been content with the act itself, with the secret power it gave him. But in 1998, he broke his own rules. He forged a will. He made himself the beneficiary. He got greedy. Why? We don't know. Perhaps the addiction had progressed to the point where he needed more, not just the act of ending lives, but tangible proof of his power, concrete rewards. Perhaps it was arrogance, a belief that he was untouchable. Perhaps it was simply a mistake, a moment of poor judgment. Whatever the reason, it was his downfall. The irony is almost literary. A man who had successfully ended over 200 lives without detection was finally caught not because of his main crimes, but because of a poorly executed forgery, a crude attempt at theft that any competent solicitor could see through. It's as if the universe itself demanded poetic justice, But that's projecting meaning onto random events. The truth is probably simpler. Shipman made a mistake and Angela Woodruff caught it, and the system that had failed for decades finally, belatedly, functioned as it should have from the beginning. I'm often asked in the comments, in messages, whether I think cases like this could happen again, whether the reforms have made the system safe, whether we can trust our doctors. The answer is complicated. The reforms following the Shipman inquiry have genuinely made the British medical system safer. The independent medical examiner system, the controlled drugs monitoring, the statistical oversight, the reformed complaints procedures, all of these create barriers that didn't exist in Shipman's time. Could another Shipman operate today? It would be significantly harder. Not impossible, but much harder. But here's what I think people really want to know when they ask that question. Can we trust the systems that are supposed to protect us? And the honest answer is, mostly, but not completely. No system built by humans can be perfect. Every safeguard can be circumvented by someone sufficiently intelligent, patient, and determined. Every regulation creates new vulnerabilities, even as it closes old ones. The Shipman case teaches us that eternal vigilance isn't just a platitude, it's a necessity. Systems must be constantly evaluated, reformed, updated. Complaints must be taken seriously. Patterns must be recognized. Statistical anomalies must be investigated. And perhaps most importantly, we must resist the human tendency to trust authority blindly. Trust should be the default in human interactions. Society cannot function without it, but trust must be balanced with accountability, transparency, and verification. Harold Shipman operated for over 2 decades because people trusted him completely and never verified that trust was warranted. The system gave him power and never checked that he was using it appropriately. That can never be allowed to happen again. But I also want to say this. The Shipman case should not make us paranoid. It should not make us distrust all doctors or view every physician with suspicion. The vast majority of doctors are ethical, dedicated professionals who take their oath to do no harm seriously. They work long hours, deal with impossible pressures, and genuinely care about their patients. The medical profession is by and large trustworthy. Harold Shipman was an aberration, a statistical outlier, a monster hiding in plain sight. The tragedy is that his actions have cast a shadow over an entire profession, making it harder for good doctors to do their work, creating barriers between patients and physicians where none should exist. That's another part of his legacy. The erosion of trust, the introduction of suspicion into relationships that depend on openness and faith. It will take generations to fully heal that wound. Let me bring this to a close. It's late now. The file on my desk is thick with papers, photographs, reports, 25 years of documentation about one man's crimes and the systems that failed to stop him. Harold Frederick Shipman, born January 14, 1946, passed away January 13, 2004. In the 58 years between those dates, he lived what appeared to be an ordinary life, a working-class childhood, a medical education, a career in general practice, a marriage, 4 children. But hidden within that ordinary life was something extraordinary in its evil, a systematic campaign of ending lives that lasted nearly a quarter century and claimed at least 215 victims, possibly as many as 250. He was never dramatically cruel. He didn't torture or mutilate. He didn't leave disturbing messages or taunt authorities. He simply injected lethal doses of diamorphine and watched as elderly women slipped peacefully away. And that somehow makes it worse. The banality of it, the ordinariness, the way it was camouflaged within the normal operations of medical practice. Evil doesn't always announce itself with thunder and drama. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carrying a black medical bag, wearing a white coat, speaking in a calm and reassuring voice. Sometimes evil looks like the person you trust most. The files will remain open, in a sense, forever. We'll never know the exact number of victims. We'll never fully understand Shipman's motivation. We'll never hear him confess or express remorse. Those answers went with him into his cell on that January night in 2004. But what we can do, what we must do, is remember. Remember the victims, their names, their lives. Remember the failures that allowed the crimes to continue. Remember the reforms that followed and the work still left to do. And perhaps most importantly, remember that trust, while necessary, must never be absolute, that systems must be questioned, that patterns must be recognized, that when something seems wrong, someone must have the courage to say so. Dr. Linda Reynolds did, Angela Woodruff did, and eventually the system listened. But it took 23 years and over 200 lives before that happened. The question we must ask ourselves is, what are we willing to overlook? What warning signs are we ignoring right now in our own communities, in our own systems? Because history teaches us that the next Harold Shipman is probably out there somewhere, operating within some other system's blind spots, exploiting some other vulnerability we haven't recognized yet. The only way to prevent the next tragedy is to remember the last one, to study it, learn from it, and remain vigilant. That's why stories like this matter. That's why channels like this exist. Not to sensationalize tragedy or profit from suffering, but to ensure that the victims are remembered, the failures are acknowledged, and the lessons are learned. If this story has affected you, and I suspect it has, then subscribe to The Midnight File. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching, what this story meant to you, whether you have your own experiences with trust betrayed or systems that failed, because these conversations matter, because remembering matters, because the truth, no matter how dark, deserves to be told. Every town keeps a secret. Hyde's secret was Harold Shipman, a monster disguised as a healer, a predator who wore the white coat of medicine while leaving a trail of the departed in his wake. The files on my desk tell the story of 215 confirmed lives ended and dozens more suspected. But they also tell the story of systems reformed, of safeguards implemented, of lessons learned at terrible cost. Harold Shipman is gone now, his secrets carried to the grave. But his victims remain, in photographs, in memories, in the grief of families who lost loved ones they thought had simply grown old and tired. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their stories told. And so tonight, I've told it. The full story, as complete as it can be without the answers only Shipman could provide. I'm Julian Cross. This has been The Midnight File. The case is closed, but the questions remain. Some files never truly close. Some stories haunt us forever, and some betrayals are so profound that they change how we see the world. This is one of those stories. Until next time, keep the lights on, trust carefully, and remember that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones we never see coming. If stories like this stay with you,